Good morning and welcome back to another virtual edition of Children's Church. Today, we are going to be moving forward in our story of David and Saul. We're going to remember what things we learned about this new king that God has promised to us, and also hear about what's happening with Saul now that God has chosen a new king. And it ain't pretty. Let's start off with a quick recap.
So God has just been victorious over the Amalekites, but King Saul, he's like, I'm so amazing and great, everybody look at how great I am. So he creates this huge statue or monument so that people would know about his great victory over the Amalekites. And then King Saul and the people, they had taken stuff from the Amalekites that were supposed to be destroyed, but they kind of kept it for themselves. And they were kind of like, oh, I'll just sacrifice it to God in this different way where I can enjoy some of the different good stuff. And God was not happy at all with King Saul or with Israel, really. And now King Saul was not going to be king any longer. Samuel let King Saul know that God had rejected him as king. And then, now this is going back a couple of weeks,
You'll remember that Samuel, the prophet, was sent on a mission by God to search and find Israel's next king. And sure enough, he is told to go to Jesse, who is from the town of Bethlehem, and one of Jesse's sons, the one that nobody expected, would be the next king. And his name was David. Now, there are a couple of reasons why it's really shocking that David, out of all of his brothers, was chosen to be king. So first off, you have the fact that David has a bunch of older brothers, and David is the youngest. And we would expect one of his older brothers to be, wiser, more mature, and just, the first ones that somebody would choose to be king. It's usually the oldest one that gets to be king next, right? Well, in this case, God chooses the very youngest of all of them. Which honestly, God seems to choose the youngest person a lot of times. But that's not it. There's also the fact that David, his job was one that people were not really impressed by. David, he was a shepherd. And shepherds, they were looked down on. I mean, they always hung out with sheep, and sheep are kind of smelly, so they might have been kind of smelly. And David, he was left out with the sheep, and when Samuel came to choose which son of Jesse's would be the king, Jesse didn't even invite David into the party. He just let David out with the sheep in the field because Jesse, his father, was sure that there was no way that Samuel was going to choose David to be the king. But God, he did choose David to be king. And do you remember what explanation he gave to Samuel? There's this great verse that we read about, and why don't we read it right now? Wait. Before we read that verse, we need to sing a quick song, and it's called The Bible. Yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the word of God. The Bible. The Bible. Yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the word of God. The Bible. Bible! All right, now we can read the verse. All right, back to that verse. So we are in 1 Samuel chapter 16 today, and we're looking back at this verse from when God was essentially searching for his new king over Israel. And he says to Samuel, as Samuel is choosing who it's going to be, he says that the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And so God makes it very clear that he's not concerned with what other people are concerned about. He's not concerned about how good David looks or how strong he is or how tall he is. He's concerned about whether or not his heart is a good heart, or whether or not David is going to be somebody who loves him and follows him no matter what. Because God, he's more concerned about that than anything else, because he doesn't need David to be this strong king that's gonna, be an awesome warrior in battle and all that kind of stuff. Now, David, we're gonna find out, is a pretty strong guy, and he's gonna be pretty good in battle, but God is not relying on David to win battles. God is relying on himself to win the battles for Israel. He doesn't need somebody who's going to be strong enough to be victorious. He needs somebody who is going to depend on God, trust in God, and trust that God will win the victories and that God will supply every one of Israel's needs. Now, it is interesting that God chooses a shepherd to be Israel's next king. So, what is a shepherd? A shepherd is somebody who looks after sheep, right? Make sure that the sheep stay safe from any predators and make sure that the sheep are getting enough food and water to survive. Because sheep aren't always the smartest animals, so the shepherd will lead them towards, better grass or more water so that the sheep can have everything that they could possibly need. Now, in the case of Israel, the people of Israel, they're kind of like the sheep, and then King David would be like their shepherd. God wants somebody who's going to lead them towards God, who's going to lead them to the very thing that they need more than anything else, and rely on God to supply all their needs. He needs a shepherd king who's going to be looking after the flocks of sheep, metaphorical sheep, looking after Israel, looking after the Israelites, looking for any predators that could come their way, and then leading Israel towards God, the one who will supply all of their needs. Did you know that Jesus actually calls himself a shepherd? He calls himself a good shepherd because he was willing to die so that we could be kept safe, right? A really good shepherd would risk his own life to make sure that the sheep were kept safe. And in this case of Jesus, he was willing to die, but he is alive now. And we can follow after him and trust that he is going to love us and care for us every step of the way. And so let's sing a song that's about how Jesus is our good shepherd and our great king that loves us more than anything else in the world, and how we should trust him because of that. All right, so sing along with me. Let's sing that again. The love my shepherd is. Today's video was brought to you by the letter C for commercial. What was your favorite Super Bowl commercial? You know what would have been my favorite Super Bowl commercial? I need to get me some Pirates booty, that aged white cheddar crunchy tasty stuff. The name is silly, but my heart's not joking. I need more of those tasty, cheesy puffs. Pirates booty. We've already done so many things, but we haven't actually learned the next part of our story. Don't worry, it won't be too long. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 16, and I'm going to start in verse 13. And this is where God has finally told Samuel who it is that's going to be Israel's next king, all right? It says, "Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, or left King Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servant said to him, 'Behold, now a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre,'" which is an instrument. "And when the harmful spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well." So what in the world is happening here? We have King David. Well, he's not exactly king yet, but he's been anointed as king. So we have David, and God sends his Holy Spirit to be with David. And boy, is David going to need God's Spirit to lead him and give him strength, because he has a lot of hard things coming his way. But then on the other hand, we have King Saul, and God's Spirit has left King Saul. And it says that an evil, harmful, bad spirit was sent by God to King Saul. And I'm not really sure what that's all about, but we know that whatever this is, it is tormenting King Saul, meaning that it is just like really, really bad and making him angry and upset and anxious and all these negative things. Now, I wonder, could it be that God is allowing King Saul to be, messed up with the spirit because King Saul, he needs to be humbled? What is humility? Humility is the opposite of pride. Now, if you are a person who is very prideful, very proud, then that means that you think you're better than someone else. You think you're like the best in the world at something, and you're just like bragging about how great you are. So if you're prideful, then you're kind of boastful, or you're bragging and that kind of a thing.
Anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
And ultimately, pride at its worst, you think that you're even better or more important or smarter than God. You say, "You know what, God, I don't want to hear what you have to say. I don't want to do what you want me to do. I'm going to do my own thing because I think that that's the best idea." So pride means that you think that you're even better or more important or smarter than God. Not good. And sometimes you think that you're not like that, but in reality, every time that you go against God, you're saying, "I'm prideful, and I think that I can do my own thing. I don't care what you have to say, God." So it really is an issue that we all struggle with. But anyways, humility would be the opposite of that. So humility says, "God, you are great, you are smart, you are strong, and I think that you are way greater than I could ever be. So I'm gonna follow and serve you, even when it's kind of tough or I don't really want to do it, because I have humility. I'm willing to do those things that you want me to do, even when I don't really want to do them, but I'm still willing to do it anyways." And humility has a lot of other things in it, but that's the important thing that we're looking at today. Now, King Saul, he had a major pride issue. I mean, he was making those statues and monuments about how great he was for defeating the Amalekites, when in reality, God was the one who defeated the Amalekites, right? So King Saul, he had a big pride issue. We see time and time again that King Saul, he just wants to do what he wants to do, and he doesn't care what God has to say about it. And that is quite a problem, especially for Israel's king that's supposed to be leading people towards God, right? I mean, that's a whole set of issues. Now, King Saul, he's being tormented by this bad spirit. And I wonder if God is going to use this to humble Saul so that he realizes how great God is and that when he stands next to him, he doesn't measure up. And maybe, just maybe, as Saul grows in humility, he'll start to, care for others and think highly of others and not just be obsessed with himself. I'm not sure if it's going to happen or not, but I guess that's the hope. Now, there was something that Saul's men said. They said that they were going to go find a skillful lyre player. Lyre? What? A lyre, spelled L-Y-R-E, is a type of instrument that's very similar to a harp. It's just kind of like a smaller harp of sorts. And so the idea here was that whenever Saul was being tormented by that spirit, whenever he would be all riled up in anger or anxiousness and all these negative things, if somebody were to come in and, play the lyre, some music that was nice and soft and calming and soothing, then he would be okay. And so in verse 17, Saul says to his servants, "Provide for me a man who can play well and bring him to me." One of the young men answered, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me David, your son, who is with the sheep." And Jesse took a donkey, laden with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat, and sent them by David, his son, to Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service. So they find out that there is a boy, a young man named David, who apparently can play the lyre, he's a very good musician. And so they decide to choose him to come and live where Saul is so that he can calm Saul down anytime that he is being all riled up. But David, he's the one that Samuel just chose to be Israel's next king. God is definitely up to something here. And this is pretty crazy. So Saul has sent for David to come and live with him, essentially, so that David can play music for King Saul whenever he's being overwhelmed by this harmful spirit. But King Saul has no idea that David is the one whom God already chose to replace Saul as king. I'm sure if you knew this, that King Saul would not want David to be anywhere near the palace. But that's exactly where he is. Verse 21 says, "And David came to Saul and entered his service. And Saul, King Saul, loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer." So David is now actually a really important person in King Saul's life, where he's even carrying around his armor. They're super, super tight. But King Saul has no idea that God chose David to be the next king. This is nuts. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. David must be thinking, "God, this is crazy. I guess you really are preparing me and putting me into a place where I'm going to be Israel's next king." But King Saul has no idea. And David, he has no idea all of the trials that are going to be coming his way before he actually gets to take the throne from Saul. Because spoiler alert, it is going to happen. We're gonna stop there. So one, God is awesome. He's cool, and he just figures all this kind of stuff out, and he's in control, and he's sovereign. That's the big word for like he's in control of everything. And that's very clear here. And David, he's gonna need to rely on that Spirit of God in order to give him the strength and courage and perseverance to keep on following God even when things turn scary, because they're gonna turn scary. But you know what? David, he is no stranger to following God even when things are scary, because we're gonna hear a story next week about when he faced something that was unbelievably terrifying. You might know the story. It's gonna be a good one. I'm looking forward to it. And before we leave, some of you sent in a couple of pictures of your snow days, so I wanted you to see these amazing pictures. But that's it for this week. I will see you guys again next week. Have a wonderful week. And yeah, that's it. So here is Sam standing next to his amazing snowman. Nice job, Sam. And then also we have Toby and his family who created an incredible snow fort. It looks like the Schmitz were hard at work. Great job, guys.